with Thars Garage. In this video, I'll be working on the Team Associated B7 Bag 9. So let's get started. All right, all the parts are out of their bags, and now we can continue. All right, so the first thing we're gonna do is install the pistons onto the shafts. So let's get our shafts in order. The two shorter shafts are for the front and the longer shafts are for the rear. Interesting to see that the shock package is different than the B6-4. The B6-4 did have 13mm shocks like this car. However, they were using, if I'm not mistaken, 2 by 1.7mm pistons in the rear and 2 by 1.6 pistons in the front that were 2mm thick. These are using, the B7 is using 1.6, the 2 by 1.6 piston in the front and the 2 by 1.9 piston in the rear, but these pistons are the 2.5mm thick pistons. So we're going to use the 2 by 1.6 piston in the front. So if you take a look at the piston, you'll see the number right here. This one says 1.6. It's going to be kind of hard to see on camera. And then the rears are going to be using the 1.9 piston. So how we're going to install these are, for the front, we're going to install these with the 2.5mm washers. Then we're going to install the piston, and then we're going to install a M2 by 4mm button head cap screw. So let's grab everything that we need. And what I like to do is install the screw with a little bit of blue Loctite, because I do see these back out every now and then. So we're going to install the washer. We're going to install the piston with the number facing up. So this is the front. We have our 1.6 piston, and then we're going to install the screw. So I'm going to add just a little bit of blue Loctite when I install this, so it doesn't back out. You can use a shock wrench to hold the shaft while we tighten. You don't want to tighten too much, because you might end up warping the piston itself. But there we go. So I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of them. We're going to do 1.6 in the front and the 1.9s in the rear. All right, so here we are. This is what it looks like right now. We've got our pistons. We got a 1.6 and a 1.9. So we can set these aside for now and get our shock bodies ready to assemble. All right, so the two shorter shock bodies are for the front and the longer shock bodies are for the rear. So we're going to need the 13mm O-rings. So I'm going to do one of them because they're all going to be the same, and then I'll fast forward. So I'm going to take some shock fluid and I'm going to add a little bit of the fluid onto the O-ring and then lubricate it. So the 13mm O-ring is going to go on to the top. So you just put it on, and it's just going to sit on that, underneath that top thread. Then the smaller O-ring, which it doesn't tell you what size it is, but it's just one right here. Same thing, I'm gonna add a little bit of shock fluid just to lubricate it. And then on the bottom thread, we're gonna go ahead and install that so it sits like so. Next, we're gonna need our bushings, which are gonna be on this parts tree. We're gonna need 2 of the hat bushings and 1 spacer per shock. So these are the hat bushings here. You can see that it's kind of stepped. And then these are the shock spacers, which are a little thicker. So let's get these off the parts tree. So we have 2 hat bushings and 1 spacer. And we're also going to need 2 X-rings, our bottom cap, and some grease. So I like to use the ProTech Premier Blue, but I don't have any more right now. I'm using the Yeah Racing Shock O-ring grease, so I'll put a link below where you can get that. I've used this and had some really good results, so I can recommend it. It also comes with like a little spatula, so it's nice to use that. So the way that we're going to install the hat bushing is that smaller round diameter is going to go into the shock body like so. So once that is installed, we're going to install the X-ring. We're going to put some grease on there, and don't be shy, I've put quite a bit. So we're going to install the X-ring. Next, we're going to install the spacer. Then we're going to install another X-ring. And then lastly, we're going to install the other hat bushing in the opposite direction. So that round section will be facing towards us now. Then we can go ahead and install our bottom cap. And I'm not going to tighten this down all the way. I'm just going to leave it mostly on with a little bit of gap. And then now we're ready for the next step. So I'm going to set that aside real quick. I'm going to do the rest of them and then we can continue. All right, so the shock bodies are prepped. We have our shafts and pistons ready. So now we can go ahead and install them. So we have our rears and we have our fronts. So we're gonna need our nylon washers. Looks like we're gonna install 1 on the fronts externally and 2 per shock on the rears. We'll have 2 left over. So what we're gonna do now is get our shock eyelets. We're going to use the 0mm in the front and the 2mm in the rear. So if you take a close look at these, you'll see that these have 0. So we're going to use these in the front. And then in the rear, we're going to use the +2s. So let's get that off the parts tree and then we can continue. So now we can install, make sure you're using the correct shafts and pistons on the bodies. So what we're going to do is we're going to put some shock fluid on the threads and along the shaft and just kind of lubricate it. And then what I like to do is when I install the shaft, I don't have this fully tightened, and I'm going to rotate this as I push through, and there we go. And then now we're going to install that one external spacer. You can go ahead and tighten this down now. Nice and smooth. We have that one external spacer, and now we can install our eyelet. And I'm going to be using my 3D printed tool to get this on, and I'll put a link in the description below if you want to 3D print one for yourself. Okay, so the stroke of the front shock is supposed to be 23.5. So let's go ahead and measure that. See where we're at. We're at 23.28. All right, we're at 23.5. Now we can go ahead and install our shock pivot ball. All right, so now this shock is ready to fill up. I'm going to do the same thing for the other front shock. The rear shock is going to be slightly different just because we're using 2 external spacers. So I'm going to do one of those. 2 external spacers. And then we can put on the shock eyelet. And for the rear shock, the stroke setting is 27.5 millimeters. So now we can install the shock pivot ball. So now this rear shock is ready to fill up. Let's go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and do the other 2 real quick, and then we can move forward. All right. So now we can fill up the shocks. I just have a shock stand. So in the front shocks, we're going to use the 35 weight. And in the rear, we're going to use the 30 weight. I fill up maybe 75% to 80%. And then what I like to do with each shock is you move the piston up, but don't move it above the fluid level. Probably want to keep it like 2 or 3 millimeters below the fluid level. And then I like to rotate the shaft, try to get any of the air bubbles out that might be below the piston. So I'll do this about 20 times, just stroking up and down to see if I can get any of the bubbles out. So I'll do that for each one, and then I'll let these sit for about 30 minutes, and then I'll come back and do the final bleeding process. All right, so while those are resting, I'm going to go ahead and get some of the other pieces ready to install. So let's go ahead and get our threaded collars ready to install. We're going to need the 13mm O-ring, and what I like to do here is just add a little bit of shock fluid onto the O-ring to help lubricate it, and it helps installing this on to the body a little easier. So there's a groove in this threaded collar, and we're going to install this O-ring in that groove. So it could be a little tricky, but you just got to work it into that groove. just like so. And what that O-ring does is when these are threaded onto the shock body, the O-ring prevents that collar from adjusting itself, so it adds a little bit of friction. So I'm going to do the rest of them. All right, so looking forward in the manual, we see that the front shock is going to use the 5mm offset spring cup, and the rear is going to use the 0mm offset spring cup. So we can get those off the parts tree, and we can also get our shock caps off the parts tree. So let's go ahead and do that. So if you look at the parts tree here, this is the 0, this is the 5, and this is the 9. So we need 2 of these and 2 of these. So we have our spring cups ready. All right, what I like to do here is take the M2x4 button head cap screw in the caps and just maybe get a few threads started in each cap, so that way when we do the bleeding process it's easy to get these started and you're not struggling. So I can see that there's still a lot of air bubbles stuck in the shock, so I'm going to let this sit for some while longer and then I'll come back and finish this up. So I'm going to take a small break, but for you it'll just be a moment. All right, I'm back. So it's been about 30 minutes. All the air bubbles are out. Now we can go ahead and fill up the shocks and do the bleeding process. So I'm going to show you how to do one shock and then I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of them. So basically we're going to do one of the front shocks first. First things first, we're going to go ahead and fill up the shock and kind of overfill it a little bit so that there's like a dome for the fluid. Next, we're going to take one of our shock caps and we're going to put a few drops in there, just like that. Make sure you have a microfiber towel ready or some rags. Now we're going to go ahead and install the shock cap onto the shock body. And slowly install it, make sure you're not cross-threading anything. And fluid will be coming out of the bleeder hole. Use the wrench that came in the kit to hold the shock body as you tighten the cap. You don't need to apply too much pressure to tighten this up because you can end up stripping the plastic or having that O-ring protrude out. So now what I like to do is hold it in one hand like this and use my pinky to slowly compress while I use the microfiber towel to wipe off any excess oil that's going to come out of that bleeder hole. So the shock is fully compressed. Now we can take our bleeder screw and install that. And very lightly as you get close to that end of the screw, just as soon as you feel it shoulder up, it's good. You don't want to over tighten it because you can strip out the plastic. So the shock feels amazingly smooth. And what I like to do here is stroke the shock back and forth for about 20 cycles and then fully compress it and make sure that it doesn't come out. So this is a dead shock. This is exactly what you want. So we can do that same bleeding process for the rest of them. So let me do that and then we can continue. So all the shocks are now built and bled. I'm happy with it. So now we can install our threaded collars and then install our springs and spring cups. So all we're going to do now is take our shock collars and actually rotate counterclockwise until you feel it kind of skip, and that's the start of the thread. So then you can start tightening these onto the shock bodies. And it just says to take these shock collars all the way to the top. We're gonna adjust these when we do the ride height on the car once it's completed. So just take them all the way to the top and we're good to go. All right, so now we're gonna install the orange springs on the front and then the gray springs on the rear. So the front springs are shorter than the rears, so don't get those mixed up. So we're gonna go ahead and install that on the front, and then we're gonna install our spring cup on the bottom, just like so. And if I remember correctly, it looks like they went with a stiffer spring up front and a softer spring in the rear compared to the B6.4. So interesting to see how that is going to work out with this new buggy. All right, so the shocks are now complete and we can mount them onto the chassis. So let's go ahead and do the rears first. What we're gonna do is I like to have my bleeder screw facing the outside of the vehicle. And then on the bottom, we wanna make sure that this large flange, that's a small flange, the large flange is gonna be facing the arm. So it's gonna install like so. And we're gonna take 2 of the M3 lock nuts and install them on the top and bottom. And once you feel it shoulder up, it's good. The nylock is engaged, so it shouldn't back out. All right, so in the front, we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna install the bleeder screw facing the outside of the vehicle. And over here, we're gonna install the flange facing the rear of the car. And for the manual or kit setup, it's saying to install the lower part of the shock in the outermost hole. So let's go ahead and do that. And the top of the shock is going to get installed with an M3 lock nut. And once you feel it shoulder up, it's good. We're going to use an M3 by 22 button head cap screw to install the shock at the bottom in the outermost hole. So there we go, right there. All right, so that's it for bag 9. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe if you did. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.